By the end of that month, the nursery Brittany had already bragged about to her friends never existed, because the room she had tried to claim was now legally leased to a financial consulting firm on a 3-year commercial agreement that paid me more each quarter than Jason and Brittany had assumed I lived on in a year. The morning the first executives moved in, carrying leather portfolios past the family photos Brittany once planned to replace with baby wallpaper, she stood in the hallway speechless while I handed her a framed copy of the lease she had mocked weeks earlier. Her face lost all color when she realized the income from that office did not just secure my independence. It triggered a restructuring clause in the family trust Walter had set up decades ago. Douglas had been meticulous. Because Jason had attempted to pressure me out of my primary residence for personal gain, his inheritance share was reduced under the elder coercion protection provision, and that reduction was permanent. What he thought was a nursery dispute had become a legal record. What Brittany thought was entitlement had become evidence. Their outrage burned hot, but it changed nothing. Within 6 months, Jason and Brittany sold their oversized SUV, canceled the new construction deposit they had put down expecting access to my home equity, and moved into a rental 40 miles away after their credit was strained by obligations they had counted on me to subsidize. The cruelest part for Brittany was not losing the room. It was losing the image she curated. Her church friends learned why the nursery shower was canceled. Her sisters learned why Jason no longer spoke about inheriting the house. Even people who had once nodded politely at her little jokes about making room for the baby now knew she had tried to displace her husband's widowed mother from her own bedroom. Reputation has a way of collapsing quietly. Mine meanwhile rose. I converted the lease revenue into a long-term care fund, restored the sunroom Walter always wanted enclosed, and updated my estate plan with a scholarship in his name. Evelyn laughed the day I told her the room Brittany wanted for a crib was now called Whitmore Executive Suite on the tenant contract. But the final reckoning came at Thanksgiving, almost a year later, when Jason arrived alone, shoulders bent lower than I had ever seen them, asking if there was any way to repair what had been broken. I poured him coffee in the same kitchen where he once let his wife decide I was disposable, and I told him calmly some doors reopen, but some titles do not. You can be my son again, I said, but you will never again control what I built. Then I handed him the updated trust summary. The house would remain in family legacy preservation, unsellable by heirs. The office lease income would continue funding my independence for life. And upon my passing, the majority of liquid assets would go not to entitlement, but to those who showed loyalty. He read every page in silence. For once there was nothing to argue. Brittany had wanted my room because she thought age made me weak, grief made me pliable, and motherhood made me easy to guilt. She was wrong on all three. She reached for a nursery and exposed a greed that cost her money, status, and influence. I kept my room. I kept my house. I kept my name. And in the end, the room my daughter-in-law said would become her nursery became the office lease that paid for my freedom and rewrote their future. They tried to move me out. I turned the door they targeted into revenue, protection, and power. And that was the last decision they ever made about my home. Your room will have to become the nursery, Helen, my daughter-in-law said over roast chicken as casually as if she were asking me to pass the salt, and my son did not correct her. He lowered his eyes and kept cutting his food while Brittany smiled the way people do when they believe a decision has already been made for someone else. I remember the sound the fork made against my china. A small sound, sharp enough to stay with me. I was 68 years old, a widow for nearly 3 years, and sitting in the dining room my late husband had built with his own hands, being informed that the room I had slept in for 42 years was apparently available for reassignment. The baby needs more sunlight, Brittany added, resting a hand over her stomach as if pregnancy itself granted authority over my walls. And honestly, the guest room is more than enough for one person. One person. That was how quickly a mother could become a logistical inconvenience. I looked at Jason then, hoping for some flicker of discomfort, some defense, some reminder that he had once run feverish into my room after childhood nightmares. But he only muttered, "It makes sense, Mom. Just for a while. Just for a while." Those words have evicted more people than court orders ever have. I folded my napkin. I smiled. And I said something neither of them understood at the time. "That room is already spoken for." Brittany laughed softly, thinking I meant sentiment. Memory. Grief. She had no idea I meant something else. The room she had measured in her mind still held my husband's walnut desk, his books on constitutional law, the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, and a locked file drawer I had not opened since his funeral. She thought she was claiming square footage. She was stepping onto ground layered with promises. The strange thing about betrayal is it rarely arrives screaming. It arrives wearing family language. Says we need space. Says we're thinking ahead. Says don't be difficult. But beneath polite phrasing there can be conquest. And somewhere between Brittany discussing crib placement and Jason talking about repainting the walls in pale sage green, I understood they had been planning this before tonight. There had been signs. Brittany asking how large my closet was. Jason mentioning property taxes. A measuring tape left on my dresser last week by accident. I had ignored those signs because mothers practice denial as a survival skill. But not anymore. After dinner I walked upstairs slowly, my hand gliding across the banister Walter had polished every Christmas. In my bedroom the late sun lay across the hardwood floor in amber bands. I sat at the edge of the bed and looked around not with nostalgia, but inventory. They thought age had made me passive. They mistook restraint for surrender. On the nightstand sat Walter's reading glasses and beside them the brass key to the file drawer. Picked it up for the first time in years. Inside were trust papers, zoning maps, and one clause my husband once called our quiet insurance policy. I heard Brittany downstairs laughing about nursery curtains. I heard Jason agree the crib would fit near the east window. I let them talk. I let them believe the room was already theirs. Because some people only reveal themselves when they think they've won. And that night, while my daughter-in-law planned a nursery in my bedroom, I began considering how a room could become something far more powerful than a room. The next morning I rose before dawn, the way I had in all the years Walter commuted into the city, and for a few suspended moments the house still belonged to the old rhythm. The kettle hissed. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked 6. Through the kitchen window the maples along the property line stood bare against a gray November sky. It might have been any ordinary morning except that ordinary had been quietly dismantled while I was pretending not to see it. I made coffee and carried a cup upstairs to Walter's desk, then unlocked the bottom drawer fully and spread the documents across the quilt. Some were old enough to smell faintly of cedar and paper dust. Trust amendments. Tax records. Zoning notices I had once ignored. I read each line slowly, hearing Walter's voice in my memory, patient and deliberate, reminding me that ownership was not always what people assumed. The property had mixed residential and limited professional use rights, because the house had once held his legal practice on the first floor decades ago. I had forgotten. Or perhaps grief had pushed practical memory aside. But there it was, black ink on cream paper, still alive. By noon Brittany was in the nursery aisle of some department store sending me photographs of pastel cribs, as if consultation and consent were the same thing. I answered none of them. Instead I called Evelyn Carter. She arrived that afternoon in a camel coat smelling of cold air and expensive hand cream, carrying lemon scones and the kind of expression old friends wear when they already know more than you have said aloud. We sat in the sunroom where she listened without interrupting while I recounted dinner, the room, the assumptions, Jason's silence. When I finished, she did not offer sympathy. She asked one question. Do they understand whose house they are trying to rearrange? I laughed then unexpectedly. It was the first honest laugh in weeks. Evelyn studied the zoning papers and tapped one section with a manicured finger. Helen. In this neighborhood small executive suites lease at absurd rates. I looked at her, and something almost electric moved through me. Until then I had been thinking only of defense. She made me consider offense. 2 days later, while Brittany toured baby boutiques and Jason was at work, I drove downtown to Douglas Reed's office. His building overlooked the courthouse Walter had loved. Douglas had aged, silver at the temples now, but his mind had not softened. He read every paper in silence, leaned back, and smiled in a way lawyers do when opportunity disguises itself as insult. Your husband planned farther ahead than most men, he said. And your daughter-in-law may have just handed you leverage. Leverage. It was such a clean word for what revenge should be. Not fury. Not spectacle. Leverage. He explained commercial lease possibilities, elder protection provisions, trust triggers I had never expected to use. I listened, asked questions, took notes. By the time I drove home under an orange dusk, the fear I had carried after dinner had thinned into something colder and steadier. Upstairs, I found a yellow notepad on my dresser and Brittany's handwriting listing nursery dimensions. Closet width, wall length, window height. She had measured while I was out. I stared at those numbers a long while, then folded the paper and slipped it into my handbag. Evidence sometimes arrives looking like arrogance. That night at dinner, Brittany announced she had chosen sage paint samples and asked whether I preferred the rocking chair near the window. I buttered a dinner roll and said I was considering furniture of my own. She assumed I meant sentiment again. Jason barely looked up. They still believed they were designing a nursery. They did not yet know I had spent the day learning how a bedroom could become revenue. Over the next week, I learned that entitlement grows bolder when it goes unchallenged. Brittany stopped speaking about the room as if it were mine at all. She called it the nursery even when referring to it in front of neighbors. "Once we move Mother's things out," she said one afternoon while showing a friend through the upstairs hall, "there will be enough room for the crib and a reading nook." Mother's things. As if 42 years of marriage, widowhood, memory, and legal ownership could be reduced to storage. I was in the linen closet folding sheets when I heard it. I said nothing. Silence can be camouflage when used correctly. Jason had changed too, though in quieter ways that troubled me more. He began mentioning maintenance expenses at breakfast, discussing the burden of an aging property as if preparing an argument. One evening he asked whether I had ever considered simplifying life, maybe moving to a senior condominium with amenities. He used the gentle tone people reserve for suggestions already decided. I stirred my tea and asked whether simplification was what he called displacement now. He laughed too quickly. The sound was nervous. It confirmed what I had begun to suspect. This was no impulsive fantasy driven by a coming baby. It was a campaign. Their confidence reached a new level on Saturday when a delivery truck arrived with nursery catalogs, fabric swatches, and a white rocking chair Brittany claimed was only being stored temporarily in the upstairs hall. I ran my hand over the polished armrest and thought how extraordinary it was that she was furnishing a room she did not own while I was preparing to monetize it. Douglas called later that afternoon. He had found a tenant prospect faster than expected, a boutique consulting firm seeking a private executive suite near downtown, but outside the commercial district. They wanted discretion, parking, and traditional architecture. They wanted exactly what my first floor study and adjoining bedroom offered. My pulse steadied in a way I had not felt in months. A trap begins to close not with noise but with paperwork. Yet the moment I knew Brittany would fully expose herself came 2 mornings later. I came home from the grocery store and found her in my bedroom with a measuring tape stretched from the east window to Walter's desk, making notes in a floral notebook. She startled when she saw me, then smiled as if trespass were intimacy. "I was just visualizing where the crib might go," she said. "You do not mind, do you?" I looked at her, really looked, and saw not cruelty exactly, but the smooth certainty of someone who has never been told no by consequence. I walked to the desk, opened a drawer, removed Walter's old fountain pen and said, "It is important to measure accurately before signing anything." She laughed, believing we were sharing a joke. That evening I placed her forgotten notebook beside Douglas's draft lease agreement and compared the dimensions. Her nursery sketch. My commercial floor plan. 2 futures resting on 1 room. Jason came into the study while I was reviewing terms and asked what I was reading. "Old property papers," I said. He nodded absently and mentioned Brittany had chosen paint samples. Pale sage was still her favorite. I almost smiled at the irony. She was choosing wall colors while I was negotiating monthly rent. Before bed I stood in the hallway and looked at the rocking chair waiting outside my bedroom door like an early declaration of victory. I touched its curved back once, then turned off the light. Let them bring cribs, curtains, and assumptions, I thought. Let them decorate the fantasy. Because by then I had stopped wondering how to defend my room. I was deciding how dramatically to transform it. Douglas asked me to meet the prospective tenant the following Tuesday, and I chose not to tell anyone in the house where I was going. There was a strange freedom in secrecy once I stopped confusing transparency with virtue. I wore the navy wool coat Walter bought me for our 20th anniversary and drove downtown through a cold rain that silvered the streets. The consulting firm occupied temporary offices on the 10th floor of an old bank building, and the managing partner, A woman named Claire Bennett greeted me with the kind of direct handshake that made me trust her instantly. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, practical, and unimpressed by sentiment. She asked whether the space had privacy, street access, and room for client meetings. I told her it had once held legal consultations, contract negotiations, and my husband's evening work. She smiled and said some rooms carry authority in their bones. I thought then of Brittany planning a mobile over Walter's desk and nearly laughed. Claire wanted to see the property that week. Douglas, ever careful, advised we present it not as a desperate arrangement but as a premium executive suite. Premium. The word pleased me more than it should have. When I returned home, Brittany was at the kitchen island comparing paint swatches under afternoon light. Soft fern or muted eucalyptus? She asked, holding samples up as if I were decorating with her. Hard to say, I answered. I have been considering a darker finish. She took it as a joke again. She always mistook warning for wit. That night I slept little. Instead I opened old photo albums and found one from the year Walter moved his practice into the house during a courthouse renovation. There he was at the very desk Brittany meant to remove, clients waiting in the hall, legal pads stacked high. The room had already once been an office. I had not been transforming anything. I had been restoring precedent. The next afternoon Claire toured the property while Jason was at work and Brittany was at a prenatal appointment. I watched her take in the crown molding, the front study, the quiet street lined with old oaks. She paused in my bedroom doorway, where winter sun pooled across the floorboards, and said simply, "This will lease immediately." Her certainty settled something in me. Before leaving, she mentioned the firm would pay a premium for a 3-year commitment if I could provide exclusive use of the suite within 30 days. 30 days. Exactly the timeline Brittany had casually mentioned for moving mother's things. Fate sometimes has a sense of irony too precise to be accidental. That evening Jason brought up finances again over meatloaf, mentioning a nursery would save them future housing costs. There it was at last spoken plainly. Not about the baby. About money. I asked whether he and Brittany had assumed my room was part of their planning because they believed I would eventually fund more than childcare. His fork stopped midair. Brittany answered before he could. Families help each other. I nodded. They do, I said, and thought how differently we defined help. 2 mornings later Douglas delivered the draft lease. Monthly rent. Security deposit. Escalation clauses. Commercial use designation. I signed nothing yet, but I ran my fingers over the signature line and felt the shape of coming reversal. Upstairs Brittany had finally moved the white rocking chair into the hall outside my room, a symbolic occupation she seemed proud of. I passed it on the way to bed and noticed a folded nursery catalog on the seat, open to a page labeled Dream Spaces for Growing Families. I left it there untouched. Some illusions deserve to mature fully before they collapse, because by then the room was no longer the battlefield in my mind. It was becoming bait. And the more confidently Brittany arranged her little future around that doorway, the more certain I became she would walk straight into the trap herself. The first crack in Brittany's certainty came disguised as celebration. She announced a nursery brunch for the following Sunday and mailed invitations embossed with little silver storks, as if public anticipation could make private theft legitimate. She moved through the house with the buoyancy of someone already inhabiting a victory. I watched her place floral arrangements on the dining table and discuss where guests might admire the upstairs baby suite, and each detail sharpened my resolve. The more she staged her future, the more complete her exposure would be. Meanwhile Douglas called to say Claire Bennett was ready to finalize terms. The firm wanted occupancy sooner than expected, because a merger was accelerating their need for private client space. There was urgency now, and urgency favors those already prepared. We met in his office on Friday to review final revisions. He slid the lease toward me with a fountain pen and said, "Once signed, the use designation becomes active immediately upon deposit." I signed my name in a hand, steadier than I felt at my own wedding. It was remarkable how ordinary legal revenge looked. Cream paper. Blue ink. A quiet scratch of pen on contract stock. No thunder. No speeches. Yet in that moment the room Brittany had mentally decorated ceased to exist as she imagined it. It had become revenue. When I returned home, I found 2 young women carrying in wrapped gifts for Sunday's nursery brunch, while Brittany directed them upstairs. She stopped when she saw me and asked if I minded moving some of my books from the shelves before guests arrived. "Presentation matters," she said. I almost admired the audacity. "It does," I answered. "That is why timing matters too." She frowned as if sensing some undertow she could not name. That night Jason knocked on my bedroom door for the first time in weeks. He stood awkwardly, hands in his pockets, and spoke in the cautious tone adults use when asking a favor dressed as reason. He mentioned rising mortgage rates, the cost of raising children, how much easier life would be if we used the house more efficiently. There it was again. Efficiency. Such a tidy word for greed. I asked whether he had ever considered how strange it was to discuss rearranging my life before asking whether I wished to be rearranged. He had no answer. He only said Brittany meant well. I looked at my son and saw not a villain but a man who had let convenience hollow out loyalty. That hurt more. Yet pain can clarify. The next morning Claire's wire transfer arrived. Security deposit posted. First month paid. Douglas sent confirmation. Legally binding. I printed the notice and placed it inside Walter's old leather folio. Then I did something that surprised even me. I allowed the nursery brunch to proceed. Let the guests come. Let Brittany perform ownership before witnesses. Let illusion reach full height before collapse. Sunday arrived bright and cold. Women in wool coats filled the living room with laughter and pastel gift bags. Brittany glowed under their praise, guiding a small group upstairs toward my door. I remained below, pouring coffee, listening to footsteps overhead. Then silence. A strange long silence. One of the guests descended first. Holding a framed plaque I had mounted on the bedroom door at dawn. Whitmore Executive Suite. By appointment only. Behind her came Brittany, face pale, clutching the commercial occupancy notice she had found taped inside. "What is this?" she whispered. I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "A lease." Even before the full confrontation to come, I knew something irreversible had happened. For the first time since Walter died, the balance in this house had shifted back toward me. Brittany had invited witnesses to what she thought would be her triumph. Instead she had assembled an audience for the first public crack in her entitlement. And I had not even shown her the trust amendment yet. The room fell so quiet after I said the word lease that even the old clock in the hallway seemed louder. Brittany stared at the occupancy notice as if language itself had betrayed her. Her guests shifted uneasily, clutching ribbon gift bags, suddenly aware they had stepped into something far more intimate than a nursery celebration. One woman murmured she had forgotten something in her car, and left almost immediately. Another set her wrapped baby blanket on the table and followed. Humiliation does not always arrive through shouting. Sometimes it arrives through polite exits. Brittany turned toward Jason, who had just come in from the backyard grill carrying a platter of burgers, smiling until he saw her face. "Tell me this is some misunderstanding," she said, voice brittle. Jason read the lease notice once, then again slower, as if repetition might alter legal reality. "Mom," he said carefully, "you leased your bedroom?" I corrected him. "I leased part of the property you assumed was available. There is a difference." It mattered. The remaining guests drifted downstairs pretending interest in dessert while listening to every word. Brittany's composure cracked first. She accused me of embarrassment, sabotage, even cruelty toward an unborn grandchild. Strange how people call boundaries cruel when those boundaries block access. I let her speak until outrage exhausted itself. Then I opened Walter's leather folio and placed one more document on the dining table. The trust amendment. Douglas had insisted I wait for the proper moment. This was the moment. Jason read the clause and went pale. Attempting to pressure a trust beneficiary from primary residence for financial gain constituted coercive interference and triggered inheritance review. "You cannot be serious," Brittany whispered. But I was beyond seriousness. I was calm. The deepest power often is. "You treated my room as surplus," I said. "My husband did not." No one answered. The guests left within 20 minutes, carrying favors Brittany had arranged for a celebration now impossible to explain. By evening the house held a silence different from grief. This silence carried consequence. Jason came to my study after midnight and asked why I had not warned him. I looked up from the lease copy and said, Because warnings were what you ignored for weeks. He sat heavily in Walter's old chair, suddenly looking younger than 41, almost boyish in his confusion. We only wanted space for the baby. No, I said. You wanted leverage through my surrender. He did not deny it. The next morning Brittany did not come downstairs. I heard drawers opening, closing, restless footsteps overhead. At noon movers delivered the first pieces of executive furniture Claire had ordered under the lease terms. A walnut conference table, 2 leather guest chairs, brass nameplate. They carried each item through the front door while Brittany watched from the landing in stunned silence. Nothing destroys entitlement faster than watching replacement become reality. By late afternoon, the former nursery fantasy had begun visibly transforming into something she could not control. Jason tried once more to argue practicalities, claiming family should have come before contracts. Family should have come before assumptions, I answered. He had no reply. Yet what struck me most was not their anger but the shift in posture. For weeks they had spoken downward to me, as if age made me negotiable. Now every question they asked carried uncertainty. They were no longer directing outcomes. They were reacting to mine. That evening Evelyn called and laughed when I told her the first tenant chairs were in place. Did Brittany faint? She asked. No, I said. Worse. She understood. Understanding can wound pride more deeply than defeat. Before bed I walked into the newly arranged office space and rested my hand on Walter's desk, now polished and moved beneath the east window where Brittany imagined a crib. Sunset washed the floorboards gold. I thought the battle had turned public at the brunch, but standing there I realized it had only entered its second phase. Because Brittany had lost the room, yes. But she still believed this was about a room. She had not yet understood what the trust review would cost her. And neither had Jason. The trust review began with a letter, though its impact moved through the house like weather. Douglas had sent formal notice to Jason as contingent heir, not as punishment, he reminded me, but as process. Yet process can terrify people who have mistaken privilege for certainty. Jason opened the envelope at breakfast, scanned 2 pages, and set his coffee down so hard it spilled across the tablecloth. Brittany took the letter, read faster, and for the first time since I had known her, she seemed unable to produce immediate words. The document requested disclosure of any financial assumptions made regarding future use or inheritance tied to my residence. It sounded clinical. It was devastating. Their silence that morning was different from shock at the brunch. This was fear calculating loss. Later I overheard Brittany on the phone with her sister saying, "It was never about the house," in the strained tone of someone trying to rewrite history for an audience. But history has documents. And documents are poor listeners to revision. The consulting firm began using the office 2 days later. Claire arrived first with 2 associates, carrying portfolios and speaking in the low efficient tones of people accustomed to being taken seriously. Their presence altered the energy of the house. Cars now arrived with appointments. Clients came through the side entrance. A brass plaque gleamed beside the front walk. Whitmore Executive Suite. Neighbors noticed. So did Brittany. Every polished shoe crossing the threshold was a reminder that the space she once narrated as a nursery had become professional territory beyond her reach. Yet the true unraveling began when Jason met with Douglas without telling Brittany. He returned after dark, coat unbuttoned despite the cold, face drawn in a way I had never seen. He came into the study and asked whether Walter had truly intended the coercion clause to reach family. I told him Walter believed betrayal often arrives wearing family. Jason sat very still. Then quietly, he admitted something I had sensed all along. He and Brittany had expected to refinance against future inheritance to fund a larger home after the baby. They had counted on my compliance as part of their financial planning. Counted on it. There are confessions that wound and liberate in the same breath. This was one. I asked whether he understood now why the issue was never one bedroom. He nodded without looking up. Brittany reacted differently. She fought harder as control slipped. She began questioning lease noise, visitor parking, utility usage, hoping inconvenience might restore leverage. One afternoon she suggested commercial activity might not be suitable around an infant. Claire, overhearing from the front hall, smiled and said she had reviewed municipal codes herself. "We are fully compliant." Brittany looked as if she had been corrected by the universe. Even small moments turned against her narrative. The women from the cancelled nursery brunch had apparently talked. At church the following Sunday, an older parishioner asked me, in front of Brittany, whether the executive suite was accepting new clients. The question was innocent. The effect was not. Reputation was beginning to move independently now. Evelyn called it social arithmetic. You subtract dignity from a widow in public, and sometimes the community solves the equation for you. But what neither Jason nor Brittany knew yet was Douglas had uncovered something further during trust review. Because they had discussed anticipated equity access in email correspondence related to mortgage prequalification, those assumptions were discoverable. Evidence, once invited in, seldom leaves politely. Douglas urged patience. Let them keep talking, he said. People reveal the whole map when frightened. He was right. That week I found Brittany in the pantry on speakerphone whispering that if Jason could persuade me to revoke the lease, everything could still be fixed. Persuade. The old language again. She turned and saw me standing there. We looked at one another in a silence too clear for pretending. She finally asked, almost pleading, "How far are you taking this?" I considered the question. Then I answered with perfect honesty, "Only as far as you took it when you decided my room was yours." She stepped back as though something colder than anger had touched her. And in that moment I knew the final collapse would not come from confrontation. It would come when the financial consequences she still believed hypothetical became real. The consequences arrived not as a dramatic blow but as numbers, and numbers have a way of humiliating people more thoroughly than accusation. Douglas called me on a Thursday morning, while I was arranging winter roses in the foyer. His voice held that restrained satisfaction lawyers try not to show. The trust review had concluded its preliminary findings. Because Jason and Brittany had represented anticipated inheritance support in documents tied to mortgage prequalification, their presumptive access had materially influenced a financial application. That triggered a corrective amendment. Jason's inheritance interest would be reduced pending final restructuring. I thanked Douglas, set down the phone, and stood for a long moment letting the stillness settle. Then I made chicken soup. There is something almost sacred in answering upheaval with ordinary domestic calm. Jason learned that evening. He came home carrying a folder from the bank, jaw rigid, and asked to speak privately. We sat in the study beneath Walter's portrait, while he explained the lender had withdrawn terms on the larger home they planned to purchase. Without projected trust assets, their debt ratios no longer qualified. The house Brittany had chosen online, with the nursery she imagined should have been mine, was gone before it existed. He did not raise his voice. He looked tired. "Was this what you wanted?" he asked. Was a child's question disguised as a man's? "No," I said. "What I wanted was not to be treated as collateral." He covered his face with one hand and said nothing. Brittany did not absorb the news with resignation. She met it with blame. That night I heard them arguing behind closed doors, not loudly, but in the low urgent tones of people discovering shared ambition phrase under pressure. By morning she was insisting Douglas had manipulated things, that I had orchestrated humiliation out of pride. It fascinated me how those who plan quietly against you often call you ruthless when you plan more carefully. Yet the true public unraveling came through something smaller. At church on Sunday, Brittany's sister avoided sitting beside her. Two women from the nursery brunch greeted me warmly and asked after the executive suite tenants. One even joked she wished she had turned her son's entitlement into rental income years ago. Brittany heard every word. Social arithmetic, Evelyn had called it. It was working. Meanwhile, the office flourished. Claire added a second consulting day each week and asked whether I would consider renewing early at a higher rate if expansion became necessary. I smiled at the thought that the room once measured for a crib was now appreciating in value. Even Jason noticed the irony. One afternoon he stood in the hall watching clients arrive and said quietly, "I did not think you had this in you." "Neither did you," I answered. That was enough. But Douglas had one final instrument to place. He invited Jason and Brittany to his office the following week for formal execution of the trust revision. I attended because absence would have looked like bitterness. Presence looked like authority. Douglas reviewed the amendments in measured tones. Reduced contingent share. Family legacy preservation clause. Primary residence unsellable by heirs. Brittany interrupted twice, asking whether accommodations could be negotiated because a baby was coming. Douglas folded his hands and said, "Children do not nullify coercion." I nearly admired the elegance. When we left, Brittany lingered in the lobby, staring at holiday decorations in the marble atrium as though trying to remember where certainty had first slipped away. In the parking garage, she finally said, not to me but almost to herself, "All this over a room?" I turned and answered, "No. All this because you mistook possession for permission." She looked wounded then but also older somehow. Pride ages quickly under consequence. That night I updated household accounts using lease income, funded the long-term care reserve I had postponed for years, and sat by the fire with a sense I had not felt since Walter died. Security earned, not inherited. Yet one final truth remained for Jason to face, and it would arrive not through lawyers or lenders, but through a decision I had not yet told either of them I had already made. The decision I had not told Jason and Brittany about began with a meeting at the bank 2 days before Christmas. For months I had watched them treat my stability as a future resource to be managed, and once I understood that clearly, something in me changed. Protection no longer felt defensive, felt moral. I met with my financial advisor, a woman named Margaret Levin who had handled Walter's retirement accounts for years, and together we finalized a revision Douglas had quietly encouraged. A significant portion of my liquid estate would no longer pass through direct family expectation at all. It would be placed in a legacy trust, funding long-term care for me first, then a scholarship in Walter's name for first-generation law students. The remainder would be distributed according to demonstrated loyalty, not blood assumption. I signed the papers with the same calm I had felt signing the lease. There are moments in life when a person stops reacting and starts authoring. This was one. I told no one immediately. I waited. Timing had become its own discipline. That Christmas Eve, snow dusted the hedges and the executive suite was dark for the holiday, lending the house an old quiet I had nearly forgotten. Jason offered to light a fire. Brittany, subdued in recent weeks, moved carefully around me, politeness replacing the casual entitlement she once wore like perfume. It was almost tender, had it not come after consequence. At dinner Jason raised a glass and said he hoped the new year might bring healing. I looked at him and saw genuine regret, but regret is not repair unless shaped by truth. After dessert I brought out a slim folder and placed it beside his plate. "What is this?" he asked. "The last part," I said. He opened the estate summary and read in silence. Brittany leaned over his shoulder. Halfway down the second page she drew in breath sharply. The old expectation that the house might someday be sold and proceeds divided had ended. The property would remain protected from liquidation by heirs. The scholarship endowment was funded. Their contingent share was reduced further, not erased, but transformed into something modest enough to end all fantasy of dependence. Jason looked up first. Hurt moved across his face, but so did understanding. Brittany asked in a voice almost unrecognizable from the woman who once chose paint for my walls, "You changed everything?" I answered, "No. You revealed what needed changing." No one spoke for a long time. Firewood settled in the grate with a soft crack. Snow pressed against the windows. It was not triumph I felt, but release. The argument was over because there was no ground left to argue upon. A week later Jason told me they were abandoning plans for a larger home entirely and moving into a smaller rental closer to his office. He sold the oversized sport utility vehicle they once drove with such pride. Brittany withdrew from the social circles where she had once narrated family life as if she directed it. Consequence had become ordinary now. Monthly budgets, lease payments, lost assumptions, quiet reputational bruises, the kinds of punishments life administers without spectacle. Yet one scene remains with me most. On New Year's morning I found Jason standing outside the executive suite door looking at the brass plaque. "I thought that room meant our future," he said. I stood beside him and replied, "It still does. Just not the future you tried to take." He nodded, and for the first time in years I saw humility in him, not forced by defeat but born of recognition. That mattered. Later Claire called to renew the lease at a higher rate. I accepted. Revenue increased. Security deepened. And with each monthly deposit, the irony ripened sweeter. The room Brittany once claimed for a nursery was now funding my independence, reshaping inheritance, and preserving Walter's name beyond any one family's ambition. They had tried to fold me into their plans as an aging footnote. Instead, they became the cautionary chapter in mine. Yet there was still one final reckoning left, not legal, not financial, but public, and it would come from the one thing Brittany had valued almost as much as access: how others saw her. The public reckoning began where Brittany had once felt safest, among people who knew only her polished version of events. Early in February, the Church Women's Auxiliary hosted a winter luncheon in the Fellowship Hall, and Evelyn insisted I attend. "Truth should sometimes wear pearls," she said, fastening her brooch before we left. I almost declined. I had no appetite for spectacle. But some endings require witnesses. The room smelled of coffee, cinnamon rolls, and old hymnals, and everywhere women clustered in soft conversation beneath paper snowflakes strung by the youth group. Brittany arrived late in a cream coat, smiling too brightly, moving table to table as though rehearsing normalcy. I watched her from across the room and understood something I had missed before. Reputation was not vanity to her. It was shelter. And she knew it was thinning. During dessert, one of the older widows asked me, loud enough for several tables to hear, whether the executive suite was still thriving. I answered simply that Claire had just renewed at a higher rate. There were approving murmurs. Then another woman, one who had attended the aborted nursery brunch, laughed and said, "Helen turned attempted displacement into commercial income. There is a lesson in that." The room warmed with knowing smiles. It might have ended there had Brittany not made the mistake of trying to reclaim narrative. She stood and said with brittle lightness that family misunderstandings often get exaggerated. The phrase hung in the air. Misunderstandings. As though legal notices, trust amendments, cancelled mortgage approvals, and a leased office had all been a confusion over paint colors. Before I could speak, Mrs. Corbett, 81 and sharper than any attorney I know, set down her teacup and said, "Dear, calling a widow's dispossession a misunderstanding is ambitious." A hush followed so complete I heard silverware settle. Brittany flushed crimson. No one defended her. No one needed to. Social verdict had arrived. She left early. 2 weeks later she resigned from organizing the spring charity gala she had chaired for years, citing pregnancy fatigue. But people knew. Communities always know more than they say aloud. Meanwhile, the practical consequences deepened. Jason and Brittany moved into a smaller rental 40 miles away, the grander neighborhood abandoned. Their baby arrived healthy in spring, and when Jason brought the child to visit, he hesitated at the executive suite door before carrying the infant past Walter's old desk. I noticed he no longer referred to the room with nostalgia or resentment. He called it the office. Reality had settled into language. One afternoon months later, Brittany arrived alone. No performance. No practice charm. Just exhaustion. She sat at my kitchen table and said something I never expected. I thought I was securing a future. I was trying to control one. It was not apology exactly, but it was truth. I told her control often disguises itself as care until consequence unmasks it. She wept quietly, and though part of me remained guarded, another part recognized that humiliation had taught what kindness had failed to. But my final act was still waiting. At the annual neighborhood preservation dinner that autumn, Claire presented a community award to homeowners who adapted historic properties for civic use. She called my conversion of domestic space into professional preservation visionary. Visionary. The word drew laughter from Evelyn and a standing applause I had not sought. Brittany and Jason sat in the audience. They stood too. In that moment the story stopped belonging to private grievance. It became public reversal. The woman once nearly displaced from her own bedroom was now being honored for protecting heritage and creating opportunity. On the drive home, Jason said softly, "I used to think you were reacting out of hurt." I looked out at the passing streetlights and answered, "I was acting out of stewardship." That was the difference he had spent a year learning. By then the executive suite income funded my care reserve, Walter's scholarship had accepted its first recipient, and the house stood more secure than ever. Brittany had lost more than access. She had lost the authority she once assumed over me. And yet one final scene remained before the story could close, because consequences may humble, But true payoff arrives when power returns so completely there is no path back to what was. Power returned so gradually I almost did not recognize when it became complete. It happened not in courtrooms or church halls, but in the ordinary rearrangements of daily life that signal who now sets the terms. By autumn the executive suite had expanded to include 2 regular consulting days and 1 mediation practice sublease. All managed under terms Claire had helped refine. The income covered my long-term care reserve, restored the neglected sunroom, and funded the first Whitmore Scholarship recipient, a young woman from Ohio who wrote me a handwritten letter saying Walter's name would travel farther than he ever imagined. I kept that letter in the same drawer where the trust papers once slept. Some victories mature into legacy. Jason visited more often now, sometimes alone, sometimes with the baby bundled in a wool cap, and the old reflex of deference had changed in him. He no longer offered opinions about the house unless asked. He no longer treated my choices as negotiable. Once, while helping me prune roses, he said quietly, "I thought authority in a family came from providing. I did not understand it could come from protecting." It was the nearest thing to repentance he had ever spoken. I did not answer immediately. Then I told him protection is the oldest form of provision. He nodded as though receiving something larger than correction. Brittany's change was harder one, but perhaps deeper for it. She began volunteering at the scholarship fund luncheon, partly from sincerity, perhaps partly from repair, and one afternoon she surprised me by returning the framed nursery sketch she had once made in secret. She had found it in a storage box and placed it on the kitchen table. "I kept this because I was ashamed to throw it away," she said. I looked at the penciled crib placement beside Walter's desk and felt no anger at all, only distance. "Keep it," I told her. "It belongs to who you were." She wept then, not dramatically, but with the tired grief of someone who finally sees her own smallness. That was punishment of another kind. Yet the final transfer of power came at Thanksgiving, 1 year almost to the week from the dinner where my room was first claimed. This time I hosted by choice, not obligation. The mahogany table gleamed under candlelight. Claire attended as a family friend. Evelyn wore emerald silk and whispered that revenge had never looked so elegant. After dinner I rose, lifted a glass, and announced one more trust revision. Jason looked startled. Brittany gripped her napkin. I smiled and explained that because stewardship had been learned, not assumed, I was naming a family advisory role over the scholarship foundation after my lifetime, but with fiduciary duties tied to service, not inheritance. Responsibility without entitlement. Jason stared as though the concept itself altered him. "You still trust me with something?" he asked. "I trust what consequence taught you," I said. That was the moment everything inverted fully. Once they had imagined removing me from my room. Now they were being invited, conditionally and on my terms, into a legacy I controlled. Not as beneficiaries of expectation, but as participants under standards I defined. Later that evening after everyone left, I walked alone into the executive suite. Walter's desk stood beneath the east window where a crib had once been planned. The brass plaque caught lamplight. Whitmore Executive Suite. I touched the polished wood and understood there was no path back to the old imbalance. Brittany had paid in reputation, finances, and illusion. Jason had paid in humbled inheritance and hard recognition. I had regained not only a room but authority over the meaning of family itself. The house was protected. The income flowed. The scholarship lived. And the woman once treated as movable had become the fixed point around which everyone else adjusted. Yet even with all that, one final truth remained to be spoken aloud, the truth that would close the story not as survival, but as triumph. They had come for my room, and in reaching for it, they had handed me the instrument that secured my freedom forever. The year the scholarship awarded its second recipient, the local historical society asked to feature my house on a preservation tour, partly because of the executive suite conversion and partly because Claire had spoken publicly about how an old family home had been protected from speculative redevelopment through one widow's stubbornness. I agreed, though not for vanity. I agreed because stories harden into truth when communities repeat them. By then people no longer whispered about the nursery incident as family gossip. They referenced it as a cautionary legend. "Do not underestimate old women with paperwork," Mrs. Corbett liked to say. Even now it makes me smile. But the final and fullest reckoning came the spring Jason and Brittany tried, quietly and without telling me, to refinance their rental debts through a private family loan request drafted by an advisor who still believed my assets sat waiting behind maternal guilt. Jason brought the proposal himself, face tense, Brittany beside him unusually silent. They asked whether I would consider using trust distributions to help them stabilize. I read every page. Interest assumptions. Collateral language. A repayment plan built on expectations they had once lost, and somehow imagined could be revived through sentiment. I set the packet down and asked one question. Have either of you noticed that every crisis in your marriage still seems to begin with the idea that my security should rescue your planning? Neither answered. Then I did something that ended the matter forever. I opened the folio, withdrew the final irrevocable trust certification Douglas had prepared months earlier, and handed it to Jason. All discretionary family loan authority had been permanently removed. No heir, no spouse, no descendant could borrow against trust principle, petition against the house, or challenge legacy preservation without automatic forfeiture. Automatic forfeiture. The words seemed to drain the room. Brittany read the clause twice, then set the papers down with trembling fingers. So there is no path back, she whispered. No, I said. There is only the path you build yourselves. It was the clearest line I had ever drawn, and it held. A month later, Brittany's former social circle learned, through no effort of mine, that she and Jason had requested support and been denied under trust restrictions. Pride suffered more than finances. The same women who once admired her certainty now spoke of how arrogance had cost her a family fortune. She could not outrun the story because she had authored its beginning. Publicly, her standing diminished. Financially, they adjusted to a smaller life than they once presumed beneath them. Legally, every route toward my property had been sealed. There was nothing left ambiguous. And yet the deepest payoff came not from their losses, but from what replaced them. On the anniversary of Walter's passing, the law school invited me to speak at the scholarship dinner. I stood at the podium, looked out at students, donors, neighbors, Claire, Evelyn, even Jason and Brittany seated in the third row. And I told them a house is not only timber and title. It is memory defended. It is dignity enforced. It is what remains yours when others decide you have become movable. The room once targeted for my displacement had by then funded scholarships, secured my care, generated respected business income, and preserved the home against every pressure brought against it. It had become institution, not bedroom. After the applause, Jason approached with tears in his eyes and said, I thought inheritance meant receiving what parents leave behind. You taught me it can mean being corrected before you lose yourself. I embraced him. I did not need vengeance anymore. Justice had already done its work. As for Brittany, she stood before leaving and, in front of people who had watched her fall from certainty into consequence, said words I never expected to hear publicly. I tried to take what was never mine, and she turned that into something larger than all of us. There it was. Exposure. Admission. Judgment. Release. Complete. That night I returned home, walked into Whitmore Executive Suite, and sat at Walter's desk as moonlight crossed the floorboards where a crib was once imagined. I looked around the room they had tried to repurpose and understood the full irony at last. They reached for my room believing age had weakened me. They triggered leases, trust protections, inheritance revisions, public disgrace, financial consequences, and a legacy beyond their control. The daughter-in-law who tried to move me out lost status, lost access, lost assumptions, and lived with the reputation her own ambition forged. My son lost the inheritance he presumed, then earned back only a humbler place through repentance. And I gained everything they meant to erode. Authority, security, revenue, legacy, respect. I did not merely keep my room. I transformed it into the engine of my freedom. They wanted a nursery. I made it an institution. They planned my reduction. I rewrote their future. And from that day forward, no one in this family ever mistook my silence for surrender again.